Hi, Jackee. It's great to have you here. So, just going to a quick introduction to Jackee before we start. So, she's the author of the book 49 Ways to Write Yourself Well, Writing with Fabulous Trees, Soul Purpose, and Be Your Own Best Life Coach. So, Jackie's a trauma-informed well-being and resilience coach, creativity expert working across a range of sectors, and is also a founder of Paper Therapy and online creative journaling class. Welcome.
Lovely to be here. And it's a beautiful sunny day in London. Honestly, it's streaming in. You know how temperamental our weather is. So I do feel like I owe it to your Londoners, or UK actually. Hopefully it's good around the country, but it's looking really good. And after this, I'm going to head out to Kew Gardens for a walk because I had a long day yesterday. And walking is one of the ways that I kind of unravel myself and then unravel myself on the page. So I'm really looking forward to getting outside after our
That's
conversation.
great. And
Amazing. I feel like it's my own personal garden that I've got access to in London. I became a member quite a few years ago, and that allows you free entry. So as much as I can, I build in days where I know I've got like good 4 hours that I can go, and I do this walk now. I walk around the outer that circumference of Kew Gardens and goes through a bit of the woodlands at the back. And I'm really getting to know the gardens, and it's really a sanctuary. It's a very beautiful green space in London, and I do encourage people if they're visiting it's a nature reserve in the middle of the city. And I think, London was one of the first national park cities in the world because we've got over 40% green spaces, which I think is just amazing. And often people don't appreciate that. I think we've got 3,000 parks. Now, I think on one interview, I said we've got 300 parks in London. We've got 3,000.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
I, that now I understand the journaling topic that you were going to be doing in the workshop at the Barcelona Journaling Festival.
yes.
Because I'll admit, right, knowing that you live in London,
Yeah.
I was thinking that you having like a nature-based workshop concept.
Yeah.
I was thinking, okay, where does that fit in? Because I remember London, obviously, with parks, but 3,000 parks is not something that I would have expected. So, Glenn, tell me a bit about the workshop that you're going to hold. What's the kind of, where did it come from, the whole idea?
Well, it comes from the fact that I grew up in South London, and I grew up in a place called West Norwood. And it's originally that West Norwood was the part of the Great North Wood that ran from where I live now in South. I live in the borough of Croydon, and the Great North Wood runs from Croydon and further out, which is the outer edges of London, right up into central London, I think it was. And certainly when I was at primary school, history was always my favourite subject. We had an iconic library that was opened in 1972. The most beautiful building, copper railings, slate floors, lots of light, just the construction of that library. And that was my second home. And I used to pore over the library books that showed what West Norwood used to look like in the old days. And it was just all this farmland and, ride paths. And this was because it's originated from the Great North Wood, which is why we got the name West Norwood. And then you've got South Norwood, which is also where I used to live. And you've got Honor Oak, you've got Forest Hill, you've got, the names locate us in the history and in the origin of place. And I am very interested in place because of that love of history. So I grew up, and as children, Mum used to pack us off in the summer holidays. If we weren't going to the local play centre, some days she'd just pack us off with sandwiches and we'd just go to the park and just wild. Do you know what I mean? So parks are places that South London is very abundant with really lovely green spaces. I know South London better because I've lived in South for the majority of my life. So I've always had this connection to the land, but also behind that family home in West Norwood, our garden had this gap at the back of the garden where we could walk across a printing press that was behind us. And then we were in acres of green land. So there was an old, which was a very sort of Victorian, well, maybe it was Edwardian actually, because it was very ornate, red brick. It was called a Jewish orphanage. And it was a home for Jewish children during the Second World War who were made orphans. But by the time I think our family bought the house in West Norwood in 1965, I think it wasn't very long before it was kind of abandoned. So I used to go and play in those woods by myself, not in the woods, in the playing fields, just by myself. In the summer holidays, I'd pack my satchel, put my books, put my pens in there. And I would just go and just spend all day just wandering around when I didn't have to do domestic duty, when my mum couldn't find me. And so I think all of those things from my childhood gave me a love of nature, but also it was a way that I found solace, because by the age of 7, I was coming through complex trauma. And I had quite a few of the conditions on the adverse childhood, the ACEs, the ACEs, I think they're called, the adverse childhood experiences. And because I didn't have, it's almost like no one knew what to do. My parents didn't know what to do. Teachers didn't pick up on it because I was a model student at school. Well, that was my way of coping. That's my way of surviving. Actually, was I loved learning and I poured myself into that. But actually, emotionally and psychologically, I was living with trauma.
Yeah.
So what I found was getting out in nature with that.
Yeah.
And then I disconnected from it all by the time I got into my teenage years. Got into at the time boys and going out and raving. And then I went to university. I don't think I ever went in a park when I was at university in Birmingham. We had a park at the bottom of our road, Handworth Park.
Priorities change then when you get to that kind of time. But how's journaling in that process? Because you said you take your satchel and you got your books and your pens and stuff. And do you feel like you had like a writing history in your life that was going through it, all of it?
Definitely. There's a memory that one of my oldest friends, Pauline, we went to primary school together. So I met her when I was age 5. She said to me a couple of years ago, "Oh my God, I remember you in English class." She said, I had this brilliant teacher at school, and I actually attribute her to so much of my writing. Her name was Mrs. Hines. And she must have seen something in me, because she just had this way of pulling out the best in me. It's like, I could get to express myself creatively in her class. I felt psychologically safe at school.
Yeah.
She created a psychologically safe space for me where I probably got to express things in a way that I hadn't realized the therapeutic benefits of them.
Yeah. You can list with.
To say that thing around writing, in her class, we used to write poetry. And apparently she'd set us a task of writing poems. I'd write not one poem, but 2 or 3. And then I would go around helping all the other children write their poems. And Pauline said, she used to watch me and think, well, how's she written more than one poem already? And, I don't actually have that memory of myself. But what I do remember is I wrote a poem for a competition for the new library that had opened. We all were tasked writing a poem in our class, and I won the second prize.
Do you still write poetry?
I do, but I don't ever share my poems.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because I found, like, I've also had like my childhood trauma and this expression of it through being very good at school. That was through how that kind of became, I don't know if I can call it an escape or whatever, but I found later on in my teenage years that I was writing a lot of fiction. And it was, and later on, I've looked back at that and realized that so much of my fiction writing was essentially using, character sketch,
Yeah.
challenge techniques, dialogue writing. Obviously, all of these processes were ways for me to kind of, it became a way of therapy without realizing that's what I was doing, So I think there's a really interesting part to that.
So we're talking about similar things, aren't we?
Mhm.
Which, I came to understand the therapeutic benefits of journal writing and creative writing, because I think both of them hold all of those properties. And poetry was definitely my first entry point into writing. I remember viscerally sitting in class, maybe around age 7 or 8, and we were introduced from a yellow book, a yellow, blue, and red book that every primary school used to have, which was full of British poems by English authors. And we were introduced to Wordsworth, I wandered lonely like a cloud. And I remember kind of just floating off on this hill and just feeling like I was somewhere else. And that poem, I remember it viscerally opening me up in that room, in that space. It gave me like a transitional place that I could go to, and where I found a part of myself that perhaps when it came to my home life, it was very fractured. It was very fragmented. Whereas with the writing, I felt like I could put myself back together again. And there were parts of me that were strong and resourceful and creative, even as an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
I had a ferocious appetite for learning and creativity. I was forever with a pen and pencil in my hand, which makes sense. I've filled 100 journals. So I'm not so, I buy so many books. I buy everybody else's books. And I've loved the fact that I am a published author. But I get so much from the fact that I've kept these journals. And
You keep all your journals?
do I'm going to tell you a little story here. So since 2015, I've moved twice. So when my last relationship broke down, I moved home and I took maybe 80 journals. And I was like, Jax, this is a bit much, so I had to find 2 cabinets. Oh,
Do you reread them?
now this is a really good question, because one of my principles of journaling is that journaling is a skills-based practice.
I,
It is.
yeah.
It takes me years to acknowledge, oh, so it's not just about laying down on the page, kind of emptying myself on the page. It's what you do with what's on the page. So because when I came out of university, I got a job as a youth worker, a full-time youth worker. And that was one of probably the best jobs I've ever had, because what it did, it introduced me to the concept of reflective practice. Reflective practice was one of the core principles of being a youth worker. You reflected on your practice, and you got young people and children to reflect on that, who they are being in life. So that was a very strong core that I have taken through my work as in learning and development, in coaching and facilitation, in therapeutic work. And I know that the way that I have grown is through that ability to go back and reflect in my journals. So when you ask me the question, have I gone back into them and have I kept them? The challenge and what I'm working with is the fact that when I go back into my journals, I'm sometimes astounded by what I have written that I thought was crap.
Right.
I go back and I see entries and I'm like, oh, sorry, did you write that? Was you actually thinking that and feeling that? And so
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just checking in. So when you're saying that, like, rereading it and then being surprised of who it was, that was you, is that in the sense of its literary value, or is it reflective value in the sense that you're going into a space of yourself that you didn't know that you'd already gone into?
that's a really good question, because it's both.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's both. I'm seeing who I was and where I'd been, and I'm seeing patterns and themes. Like when my relationship broke down, I was like horrified when I went back into my journals. I talking about this not working for years.
Right. So you knew in your journal that it was working before you got to the cutoff point.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is something I find extremely fascinating because I don't keep my journals. I keep some in between, mostly random ones that I've forgotten to throw away. And what a big part of it for me is around that you learn so much about yourself in journaling, right? There's such a depth of, just like you talk about reflection, right? Now, reflecting in the book is great, but for me, the question is, how do you extract it and apply it and use it? And
Yeah.
happen there is something that I see very much in my own stuff. And I've got notebooks in my journals that I look back at and I'll kind of fold the pages in. So I know that I wrote something valuable here. But then I'm looking at it and going like, so if this was true, then why have I not changed the way that I behave or think?
I love that. Because this is a place where in all of my workshops, I'm really inviting people to inhabit that journal is a reflexive practice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that piece that you're asking, if this was true, well, why haven't I done anything with it? I think this is the piece where it's part of the pedagogy around journaling and therapeutic writing that often people are afraid of, or they don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't necessarily got all of the tools, you know. So you and I, and you know, the faculty who are going to be at the Barcelona Journaling Festival, when, you know, I feel like we're all on a mission to share some of those tools so that people are better equipped to know how they can really do some of that self-work, that personal growth. Journaling is a growth practice.
Yeah.
You know, it's undoubtedly so.
I
Now,
completely agree.
say that again, Oliver.
No, I completely agree. I think this is, and I love what you said about the skills part of it. I think, okay, so I think as much as Julia Cameron has done a great job of getting people to start journaling with morning pages, there's a fear in this for me that it also means that people just spend a lot of time vomiting on page, which is a very useful technique, but perhaps there's some skills missing in the actual reflective part.
Well, Julia Cameron was, I think she was the catalyst for me really embedding a journaling practice. I was in my late 20s, no, sorry, early 30s, when someone sent me her book. A friend in America sent me her book when she first wrote it. And at the time, I wasn't acknowledging to myself that I was actually experiencing depression because of the complex grief around the complexity around my trauma, which it hadn't really fully been processed. I hadn't gone into, you know, full-time, you know, a long period of therapy at that point. I was doing lots of spiritual courses. I was doing lots of personal development courses, but I wasn't doing that solid body of work where somebody else was holding a safe psychological space for me every week to process what I had gone through. And so when I got that book, it's like I was in bed. I didn't want to get out of bed, but that book got me to go upstairs, get a pen and start writing. And, Julia Cameron, I initiated her coming over to Alternatives in St. James because I'd known her work for years. You know, I owe so much to her, but I spent years vomiting on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like I was a good vomiter.
Yeah, no, this is my experience of it as well. Like, I mean, I'm very good at chucking tons of my intel on page. Like, that's really one of the reasons why I don't read my old journals.
Yeah.
I just look at this and go like, why would I read all this shit?
But, you know, I've noticed a change in my journals as I've gotten older because when I have gone back to some of the later journals, I do find fragments that I'm like, oh gosh, you wrote that. That would be so good for something you're writing. So,
Mhm.
oh, someone's said this to me. I have a different color pen and I draw a little pen sign when there's something in my journal that I think, oh, that's going to be useful for an article. Or, I take excerpts from my journals and I share them on workshop because I want to make it. I want people look at me, they look at this kind of, how I'm showing up and they think, if someone said to me the other day, I always used to look at you and think, I haven't got anything together. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, if you have my journals, well done.
You got everything together because you actually got you get it out in the journal, right? Neatly. So the point then, Julia Cameron, then you talk about all this vomiting, and we're both obviously very good at this. Now, I want to go back to the skills-based part you talked about, right? Where do you see the skills of journaling come into this, and how does that kind of develop with Julia Cameron?
So, one of the things that I realized was that I kept repeating the same things. So I was vomiting and I wasn't doing that sort of inquiry, that reflexive piece of going back. And I think I became really interested in the therapeutic benefits of journaling. And I just started reading everything that I could. I was particularly interested in the research. So obviously James Pennebaker, the fact that his or research was based on the impact of trauma and how journaling can offer a therapeutic release. I just found really fascinating. And he did loads. I mean, it's a longitudinal study. And, some of the research that he did, for example, with Spurrier et al., around engineers who had lost their jobs. And when they journaled, those who wrote about how they were emotionally feeling actually got jobs quicker. And actually, just responded much better than those who I think they just kept a diary of what they did in that day. So I knew that I wanted to move beyond the just getting it down on the page. And when I've been reading Kay Adams for years, again, I'm very interested in who's writing in the field. So people like Kay Adams, Christina Baldwin, Tristan Rayner, all of those books, I just gobbled them up. And I think when I came across Kay Adams's Journal Ladder, I think that really seeded this idea that we're using different approaches. And it really confirmed some of the work that I was doing in workshops. So many years ago, I remember I ran this workshop. We had about 15 women in this workshop. People were sitting on chairs, sitting on the floor. And I got them all to do a 7-minute writing practice which I call 7 minutes of spiritual grace. So it was like just pausing your day and just thinking about what are you feeling, what are you noticing, what are you going through. And because we were in person and I was holding the space, it was really interesting to just feel into what was happening in the room. It was like a hush went over the room. And there were all these women just like writing, just writing. I don't know what they were writing, but they were just writing. And when I said I had this little chimer, did the chimer. No one looks up. Do the chimer again. Still writing. And then a few people look at me like, don't stop us now. And it continued. So anyway, in the moment, what I recognized was that sometimes we need structure. We need prompts. And we need a little bit of a guidance of where to go to next. So what I got them to do was like, now write about what you've just written about. And I'd come across this idea in a beautiful book called Soul Between the Lines. It was published in 1999 when I wrote my first book. The author's name is Dorothy Randall Gray. And it's just full of all these wonderful writing and journaling activities. And one of the core principles that she introduces in that book is this idea of going back into your writing and extracting what she calls seeds. And the seeds are words that jump out at you from what you've written. So I was working with a coaching client recently, and she did a writing practice in the coaching session. And I got her to go back in and extract the seeds. And guess what? The seed that she extracted, the word tired showed up about 4 times in the piece that she'd written. And that was really helpful because it helped her to see a theme that was emerging out of the writing. And then she could take that and write, and she could either explore it more or she could write it more. And then Dorothy Randall Gray introduced the second principle, which is, she calls it the food for thought. So that's a bigger chunk of the writing. You know, like sometimes I said, I go back into my journal like, oh, did you write that? So it could be a few lines or a few sentences. When we do our Tuesday morning, early morning writing group, sometimes we get the women to, after they've done their 7 minutes writing, so that practice has traveled with me for about the last 20 years now, we get them to sometimes drop into the chat a food for thought, which is a sentence that just jumps out of them. You know, they're like, oh, maybe I'll write some more on this, or maybe there's some more in this. So that principle of the seeds and the food for thought actually then gets the person that's holding the pen to kind of do some more work on it. And I think that's what Kay has done really well. She's given us all of these different tools and activities and approaches that actually allows people, you know, I see it as people come to journal writing, it's like you're walking up a hill and you're all walking towards the same tree, but you're coming through different doorways.
Yeah.
And people need to have different ways to enter the journal writing.
Okay, so from this, the seeds and the food for thought is something I find really powerful and really interesting, and it's something that I'm focused on a lot. And I don't know how familiar you are with Jung's psychological alchemy and his 4-stage process, but he talks about going to the darkness, and he calls the whitening, which is the process of integration, and then the yellowing, and then the reddening. I can usually ignore the reddening part because of about enlightenment, and I haven't quite got there yet. But putting that on the side for now. But the first 3 stages are really interesting, and it's about like observation, going into the shadow work,
Yeah.
then the integration, and then the future kind of developing based on what you've learned. So for me, the seeds and the food for thought seem to be very much in that whitening stage where you're kind of taking something from it. Then the question is, how do you bring that into practice? Which I think is where perhaps journaling at the moment is missing something. Like because I found myself just circling around the dark and the light and just found myself very comfortable in the shadow work because I don't have to make any changes. I can just observe my shit and then go back into the shit and observe it some more. But the real process is in learning from it and then go, right, I'm not going to go into the same path. How do we create that process? So then I guess distilling my question is, how do we use the food for thought and those seeds into our next stage of the journaling?
Well, in all of my work now, and it has been for the last the last few years, I really embed the reflection right, Deborah Ross, Kay Adams, because I think those questions around what are you noticing, what have you become aware of, what has surprised you, I've added a few, what are you not writing about, what are you not speaking about? You know, what are you ignoring here that really needs to have been on the page? And, you know, I say that as something that has come out of my own practice because I noticed that sometimes, I like what you just said about sometimes you can just do the observing. And I can't remember, this comes out of the work of Christina Baldwin. She has these 3 kind of ways of looking at how we can kind of show up in the journals. We can either be a walker, and that's where we can just describe what we're going through in our day, the things, our activities. And I've noticed sometimes if I've kind of fallen off the wagon a little bit with my journal writers, sometimes I get very good at describing what I've done in my day. Do you know what I mean? Like I've become a real nice little diary writer.
I call that tick box
Tick
journaling.
box journaling. That's a great term for it. And then she says there's the watcher. And I think that when we're becoming more skills based, that means that we're becoming more reflective
Hmm.
and more reflective with the writing. I'm hoping this is what Christina Baldwin means, because I'm just interpreting what she said. And this is where you begin to do like a deeper dive into like a personal inquiry. And you're more focused on your personal growth. So you might start to bring in some of those questions. And I
Hmm.
guess where we're going to now is, how do you kind of have an integration between the walker and the watcher? Because what Christina Baldwin says is in that space between the walker and the watcher that you enter that space of the witness. And the
Uh-huh.
witness is who takes those skills and looks at the emotions and understands the shadow in everything, that begins to understand the possibility of what is underneath everything. That's the spiritual practice of it. And
Yeah.
because I've had a lot of shadow in my life, and actually I feel the shadow is what gives me energy, it's my life force, actually, because
Mm.
it's going back to the shadow. I used to think like, if you, as somebody who's a coach, for example, there can be a collective consciousness that we have to be perfect in our lives. Do you know what I mean? Like you have to have your shit together. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I feel it's because I am willing to go into those uncomfortable places about myself, that actually, when I'm working with senior leaders, when I'm working with GPs, when I'm working with people, leaders from a range of different professions, they always tell me, which I just feel there's a wholeheartedness about you. This
Hmm.
think about when I'm in the room, when I'm in the space with you, that allows me to feel trust and to feel safe and to bring out parts of myself that like for me, going into nature means that I bring out parts of myself that sometimes might hide in an organizational culture. You bring out those parts of themselves that need the light. They need the space. They need to be seen, but there might be some darkness there. And I'm not afraid of my darkness. I'm not afraid of the dark things that happened and are continue to happen.
I think that's incredibly interesting. And it's something like I'm very much into the shadow work, probably too much at times. But one of the reasons I probably got into it was through a fiction writing course where it was around shadow writing. And for me, the premise is essentially that if you're writing fiction, you can only write about a fictional character that has an emotional depth
Yeah.
that matches your own.
Yeah.
You can easily write a shallow character, but a character that really embodies a depth of self and an understanding of their own trauma and their own shame and their own kind of the shadow side, basically, that can only be done if you're willing to go into that space yourself.
Yeah.
And I can imagine that kind of transfers to the way that you go into a space when you are working with people. That essentially, if you're willing to, I don't know, wear the shadow on the outside, to use a very
Yeah.
poor expression of it,
More.
people have an opportunity to see, ah, okay, so that darkness that I have inside is not just me, right? I'm able to go into this place because that my shadow is not going to scare you because you've
Yeah.
been dealing with many shadows.
Yeah. I think that's a really good explanation. I love the term wearing your shadow on the outside, because most of the times we're hiding the shadow. We don't want no one to see the shadow. We
For
feel
sure.
like we're bad people if people see our shadow. And then we hiding from ourselves in our journals. Or we're just hiding from ourselves and not even going to our journals. And I know in terms of mental health and well-being, I mean, it's escalating, and forget, the kind of the inroads that have been made, for example, with AI. Our mental health and well-being is escalating at an incredible speed.
Mm.
So I appreciate some of the things that AI is bringing, but what are we going to do? to be able to take care of our souls. And I use that word with absolute clarity. In this modern world, we have to be able to look after our souls. It is soul work.
So that's something that brings me back to what you were saying earlier, because you pointed out something I'm incredibly interested in, is the idea of what are we not writing?
Yeah.
It's a question that in my own journaling, not so much now because I've kind of got more used to it, but it used to be a prompt for me in my own journaling. What am I not writing now?
Yes.
And this is something I got from Natalie Goldberg in her writing poems.
Yeah.
And I loved that book. And I loved how it was essentially a guide to curiosity and exploration of honesty. And I think for me, curiosity and honesty are the two absolute fundamentals in journaling. I don't think anybody would journal if they don't have curiosity as a baseline, because writing down any introspection has to have a huge amount of curiosity there in the first place. Like, why am I feeling the way I am? Why am I the person that I am? These are kind of fundamental questions that, to go away from that tick box journaling and into where the juicy bits are, there has to be a desire to find out more. But then, if you don't bring in the honesty, and perhaps honesty is actually that combination of that curiosity and going, what am I not writing now?
I've written down those words because I'm just thinking around the body of work that I've done over the years in journaling. And I'm not sure everybody comes to a workshop aware that they are curious.
That's a good distinction.
Because what happens, what I've noticed happens is that the writing helps people become more curious.
But don't you think there's an act of curiosity to go to something that you don't know what is?
I still come back to the premise that I've seen people in workshops, for example, and maybe I'll give you another example of this. If I teach on supervision courses, and the module that I do is part of what they have to do on the program. So not everybody in that room necessarily wants to be journal writing.
That's fine. I can see that. But then they're not choosing journaling as that. And you're always going to meet resistance there, right? And quite possibly a lot of those people desperately need it, right?
But they change throughout the workshop. That's what I see. And there's this wonderful quote. Oh my gosh, I've forgotten. It's one of, I'm sure it's one of Julie Bolton's book, but the writer's name is Elaine Trevitt. And I think she tells this little story of she's in her garden, she's gardening, and a poem comes to her. And she drops her gardening tools, runs inside because she's got to capture the poem in the here and now, you know? And what she went on to say is that sometimes we show up even in front of our journals, or even on a workshop, and we think we know what we want to write or what needs to be written. But when you allow yourself, and we're not that far apart, but I would probably use more open, when we're more willing to try something different. And I guess that's what you're saying about being curious.
Yeah.
For me,
the essence of curiosity is essentially questioning everything that you say, right? So when I'm writing down, I often start my journal with basically, how do I feel this morning? And then I will often question that. And is that really how you feel? Or is that just like the top layer level of how you feel? What do you feel underneath that? Because if I wake up and I'm tired after a night's sleep, then that tiredness is probably a representation of something else. Then am I physically tired? Am I emotionally tired? Am I psychologically tired? What is that layer underneath it? And then I use that level of curiosity to go there. And the only thing that holds me back is essentially my willingness to be honest or not. Like, am I willing to face up to my inadequacies first thing in the morning?
I think you're a lot further along, Oliver, than lots of people.
Yes. Yeah, of course. I mean, I've been doing brutal journaling
Yeah,
for quite some time.
absolutely. And I think
And
I work a lot in corporates,
mhm,
and I bring journaling into my coaching sessions. And
mhm.
for a lot of people, they haven't stopped and asked. They haven't even stopped. Haven't paused. And they certainly have not asked themselves the kinds of questions that you might be asking in your journal.
But the reason why is I remember when I was a kid in Norway and it was dark in the afternoons.
Yeah.
Sure. And I remember walking home from the school bus and on the snow and it's crunchy and you can hear the echoes around. And there's a black forest on one side because it's so dark. The pine trees they're not green
Yeah.
anymore. It's just dark. And on the other side, there was a lake that had all these kind of fearful elements of, what's unseen,
Yeah.
hidden behind, underneath there in the depths. This is like my balance walking home, right? Had the depths of the unknown in the water on one side and the dark forest on the other side. I was walking on this road. And I remember that there were moments when I wanted to run and there were moments when I did run.
Yeah.
But I knew that as soon as I start running, I can't stop.
Yeah.
Because at that moment I've given in to fear. And I think when you're talking about this idea of like not people don't stop, they just keep going, they don't take a pause. And that's because I think when you start running and you're scared that something's going to catch up with you, you can't stop because if you do stop, it will catch up with you.
Yeah.
Right. So once you make that first step to run, and I knew this is so funny you're saying because it kind of brought me into this memory of that I need to not run. Even when I hear something that sounds like crunches behind me, that somebody's following me or some sound somewhere, don't run. Because as soon as you run, you can't stop until you get home.
But and also just coming back, I'm just like listening to you and thinking about this. I want to just come back to the concept of the different doorways,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what I've realized. So, like, for someone who perhaps hasn't given themselves that time and space to really think about what's going on emotionally, what I've noticed with the journal writing is that often there's so much inside, but you've just got to offer them a doorway that doesn't feel as confronting to them that they want to run.
How do you do that?
So it's a break. What was correct? So I'm gonna, I was just thinking about some recent coaching that I've done. So I'm doing some coaching with people in places like Slovakia and like different, so not necessarily the UK, working in global leaders are working in global companies. So one of the coaches that I'm working with said to me in the middle of the session, "Oh my God, I've been writing unsent letters since our first session because there were some very difficult relationships that she needed, she brought to the coaching. And
Mm.
we explored this theme of using the unsent letter as a way of unraveling what she was feeling. And now she's doing it. She said, I'm doing it whenever I'm feeling unsettled or agitated. I just do my unsent letter. Now, I could have gone straight into let's look at how you have a difficult conversation, all the tools you use and that. But I came in and at it at another level.
Yeah.
And now she's been able to integrate that.
Yeah.
I'd love to bring in metaphors around nature because what I've experienced is that, let's just say I'm in a room full of 40 people, they're on a training course. If I say to everyone, just turn to your partner and share a story of a tree from your life that means something to you. That I've never had somebody in a room say, I've got no tree. I don't know what you're talking about. Everybody has a tree. It's a symbol, isn't it? Of some nature. Whether it's
Yeah.
tree you liked, a tree you didn't like, everybody's got some symbol or image of a tree. And when I was going through what I hadn't again named, a depressive period in my 30s, I started leaving home and walking to a tree. Sorry, I started running. I used to run around my local park and then I'd run up and finish off at this oak tree at the top of a park. And I would go there every day. And that is where I would kind of do my meditation. I would kind of just, the tree was like, I think it became a transitional place for me between the outer world and the inner world. And the fact that the tree was standing still meant that I could bring parts of myself and allow myself to be very honest about myself just in the presence of this tree holding space.
Mhm.
And so with all of these different experiences, I started playing around with trees in my coaching work. And so I started developing all of these prompts that were kind of nature inspired. And one of the prompts that I found really does resonate with people, and it doesn't matter what level of an organization they're at, it doesn't matter what sector or what profession I'm delivering a workshop in, I get people to answer this question around a problem or a challenge that they have. I say to them, write for 7 minutes on what would that ancient old, wise tree have to say to you about this problem right now? I've never had anyone resist that question. I've never had anyone say, what do you mean the tree? People just see, there just seems to be something inside of us that is willing to be with nature because we are nature. And I think there is a kind of collective consciousness around the whole symbolism and the cultural connection to trees that connects us to ourselves in some way.
Yeah.
And it's a way of inviting people to go into a third space.
Yeah. Mhm. I like that actually because it gives you access to that kind of that inner wisdom of yourself, but you can externalize it.
That's right.
And I think journaling to me is very much an idea around the suspension of disbelief,
Yeah.
like that. Right. You know, when you're watching a film and then the director does something really stupid and bollocks, you just messed up the whole film now because it takes you out of that magical moment. And I think like particular certain journaling techniques like dialogue writing, which is one of my
Yeah.
absolute favorites, you have to have a willingness to suspend disbelief in that point. You have to go, I know that it's my hand, my pen, and my paper, and I'm writing both sides of this dialogue. That means rationally, I cannot expect anything to come out here that would surprise me. However, that point when I let go, there's so much surprise that comes out of it. But I imagine what you're doing there in that point of shifting that, instead of calling it your inner wisdom, which can probably bring out a lot of resistance in a lot of
Yeah.
people, by calling it that wise old tree,
Yeah.
then suddenly you kind of give people an excuse to go, well, yeah, no, I'm just imagining what the tree would say, and I don't have to imagine that it's my own wisdom.
And I think the word imagine is really important because it allows people to go deeper
Mhm.
into parts of the self that perhaps may have not been explored. And I really like the term suspension of disbelief because we can become we can just go into self one, just thinking the way we've always thought.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And just coming up with the answers to the solutions that we've always connected or what other people do or what is expected of me. And I'm all about what more is there?
Yeah.
Do you know, it's like I'm always about like at the edge of this, what beyond this? And I'm just blown away by what comes out. What people say to me, I cannot. To use the word magical, I think some people might find that fluffy. I'm telling you, I could never come up with what people get to just through, having a prompt. And I created 49 prompts in these sort of card deck because I used to do the workshops and we'd do all these prompts. And honestly, I'd get the groups to say, okay, let's come up with some nature inspired prompts. And they'd all say to me, Jackie, we need these in a deck or something. So eventually I put them into deck and they're very simple, like things like, let's see, what everyday small actions or behaviors allow you to blossom? Or what kinds of environments, people, or places inspire you to flourish? What is it time to incubate? Looking back over your life, what have you grown through and into? How do your roots strengthen and nourish you? I mean,
Is this stuff that you're going to be using in the workshop in the
yes,
festival?
it is.
Yeah.
A little deck is coming with me. Yeah, we're gonna choose some prompts and we're gonna journal because do you know what, Oliver? It doesn't actually matter where you start.
I know. I produced a deck as well myself that I was using with people. And I think my key point was if the prompt on the card doesn't resonate, that is your cue to write about why.
Yeah.
There's that kind of willingness to go, well, I don't like this. Okay, great. That's fantastic. That's the best prompt you can imagine.
Yeah.
Why do I not like something? Like,
But so I see the prompts as a jumping off start and a place that you can begin. I never forget, years ago in 2000, I think it was, I tore out of this article from an Oprah magazine by Twyla Tharp. She's a choreographer. And it was simply because of this line that she had in her article. It was a good article about creativity. She said, starting is not the same as beginning. Because she was like, when she had a dance to choreograph a new dance, she says she gets a box and she starts to think about the dance that she wants to choreograph. And she starts to notice all the places in her life where she's interested that has a connection to this dance. So if you go somewhere and she finds a leaflet, and on that leaflet, there's a quote, she said, oh, that'd be really good for the dance. That leaflet goes into the box. And she starts to collect everything that starts to kind of stimulate her thinking. And that's why she says starting is not the same as beginning. Because sometimes we want to start at exactly the place where we think.
right.
Or beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. The difference between starting the whole process and the beginning, middle, and the end.
Yes.
Actually.
And that's how I see prompts.
Yeah.
They get you in.
Yeah.
Where you go after that is entirely where the writing wants to take you. Do you know? I know that these are a way in.
Yeah.
They're not the answer.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
they might
Yeah.
be for some people, but they're not going to be for everyone.
Yeah.
It's just a way of getting you onto the page.
So, in all of this, where do you see journaling going forwards? Like, we've talked a lot about the skills, we talked about, different ways in, we talked about, the essence around like the willingness around the shadow and all these kind of ways that there has some real value. But I feel personally that I see the world having less empathy at the moment, at least in a more kind of overt way that it feels much more polarized. And my idea is that the opposite of polarization is empathy. And I'm curious what your take on it is and where you see, for example, like how journaling can help bring people together.
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. I think that we are in a place right now where we are absolutely saturated with knowledge. I mean, it's coming at us from every single direction. You can access anything. It's almost anything you want to know about. It's at the touch of a fingertip. And I was thinking, what that's doing is it's a very dangerous call for us to disconnect from what makes us unique as human beings is that we're in a body and we've got emotions and we've got feelings. And I think it's causing a lot of unwellness in the world. I'm somebody who navigates through the world. I'm an older woman now, and it's really interesting me just noticing how people move through the world. We're moving through really very aggressively, even just the way we're navigating through spaces. And that's because of disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, we have something called social prescribing, which GPs have gone into prescribing going into green spaces for people to really strengthen their well-being, their mental health. And I think journaling is going to become a part of hospitals' prescriptions. It's going to become a part of doctor prescriptions because, as we talked about at the beginning of this, it is a skills-based practice, and it's a practice that can become as impactful as it can be to take a pill, to be prescribed medication. I think there is a way in which writing and journaling is becoming a form of medication that we can self-prescribe, that we can self-engage with in a way that can very impactfully and in a very heartfelt way make a difference to how we feel or how we respond. Because it's not about necessarily making difficult things disappear, but it is certainly a difference in how we respond to things. They found from research that when people walk out in nature, they say hello to each other more. They're kinder to each other. Can you imagine? You're pushing your way on a train, people knocking you out. You imagine if we spent more time out in nature, how we might show up on a platform, how we might hold space for each other and with each other. And I think our services here, certainly in the UK, the NHS is at full capacity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're here.
I love what you said though, sorry about this.
No.
I loved what you said there about it doesn't make things disappear.
No.
And I think this is perhaps one of the diseases of the current time, that we want bad things to disappear.
Yeah.
We're looking for a way to just make it go away, but it doesn't. And I think this is where perhaps journaling has that real power, that there isn't a way to observe things. I mean, I know we're going on with time here, but there's one thing that I found incredibly fascinating, this metaphor around these heavy emotions. And I think for men, especially, there's a lot of this kind of pushing it down. And I'm like, my metaphor is just closing up, sticking it in the cellar, chuck it in the cellar, close the door and stick an extra padlock on. And if this door starts shaking, stick another padlock on. But for God's sakes, just don't go down there. Because if we go down there, we see that it does exist. And if I keep locking that door up more and more, it feels like it's not there. I can pretend that it's gone. That disappearing act, which obviously never works. It just comes back to bite you with a vengeance.
I think you're absolutely right. Are you familiar with the research of Matthew Lieberman on men writing journals?
No.
Matthew Lieberman, in his research, they found that when men kept journals, it impacted their emotions much more quickly than the women that they had in their studies. And I've had lots of debates in workshops around why this was. And I think at the heart of it, I think he's getting to the issue that you've just spoken about. It was when men got access to writing their journals that actually they found it had such an impact on them, them realizing that this was a space that they could release emotionally. Where for a lot of women, they've tended, when you talk to women about their lived experiences of keeping a journal, almost every other woman goes back to, I had a diary when I was 6 or 7. which had a little lock on it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Get
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
even those kinds of things. Well,
But this is an interesting aspect as well, though. I think if you look at, I think women are much more developed in their capacity of speaking about emotions, just partly because of what you said. That door was open much earlier on in their lives, right? So that means if you look at the research, that comparison you talk about massively, then presumably it'd be quite obvious, because if women have got a skill set that's up here, the benefit of journaling is kind of like topping up that
yeah,
part, right? For men, it's like, Jesus Christ,
it's
this is, you've got a lot to work with.
yes. So you see them. I guess I imagine in that study they probably had a very immediate impact on them.
Yeah, I mean, the guys I've been working with, it's just really, because a lot of the guys have started off with morning pages as journaling.
Yes.
But then when you add in elements like, points of view writing and giving people an opportunity to suddenly just looking at like conflicts in the relationship or whatever it is, any conflict, and then writing about that same situation from your own perspective and then from your partner's perspective.
Yeah.
And then seeing like their faces light up and go like, oh my God.
Yeah.
That kind of depth of understanding and empathy, even though it's not true, which I think is a really important thing to kind of bring into this discussion. I don't think journaling and self-reflection is true in the sense that when I'm writing about, my childhood trauma, I'm not writing the truth. I'm writing my observation around it. And that doesn't matter that it's not true. What matters is that, does this give me an understanding that can help me change the way that I react
Yeah.
to, in the next situation that I'm in,
Yes.
in conflict?
Because often what happens, we'll get stuck, we'll get stunted.
Yeah.
Even as adults, we're still responding to things from our 7-year-old self or our 10-year-old selves.
I saw a great description on this. I can't remember who it was now, but he described that when you're triggered,
Yeah.
that moment, you are not experiencing the current thing that's happening. You're experiencing the past and you're living the past experience in the current moment.
Yeah.
And that takes you completely away from what's actually going on. You're not living now.
Yeah.
You're living in the history of your, shit experiences.
Absolutely. And, I was thinking, I listened to a couple of your YouTube videos, and I think it was when you were talking to John, who's going to be doing the city or
Yeah.
one of the workshops,
Yep.
Barcelona, and he talked about Jung and the Jung saying that you've got to choose a fragment of who you are in your life and how you see yourself. And it stayed with me so much. I've taken it into my journal and I've been thinking about it because I realized that I've been losing a lot of friends lately as we're getting older, and life and death is, you're just confronted with it.
Mm.
And I thought that like there is this, when we're younger, we all want to be and do and conquer. And I think for me, what I realized when I heard John talk about this, I thought, this is the thing that I've really gotten from my journals, that I've lived a good enough life.
Huh, that's beautiful.
I just know it.
That's beautiful.
There's not, I may not get the accolades, I might not get the awards, I might not get the whatever, but I know not only have I lived a good enough life, I've lived a rich life. And I honestly, it makes me weep just even thinking of that, because it goes back down to the very core
Yeah.
of who we are as human beings, that actually we are enough. And, I know what I have struggled with and what I continue to struggle with. And I know that my mission of being a catalyst, being a seed for whatever, that people can see the goodness that is inside of them in the way that I've had to try and find that for myself of the professional support that I've had and the kinship from my friends and family members. Do you know what I mean? But the journal writing, I think, it's kept me here. It's kept me here without a doubt. From a teenager who had suicide ideation, didn't even know what that was about, but just
Mm.
I would wake up every morning and want to cut my wrists and like, what was that? What was that about? No one to talk to about that.
Yeah.
But the
Can resonate with that.
journaling helped me root myself in life.
Yeah.
And I'm still here. The tree is still growing. And it loses leaves, it loses branches, it loses people. People do horrible things, people do good things, but the tree still keeps growing.
Thank you. That's amazing. That's absolutely brilliant. And I am really looking forward to seeing you at the Barcelona Journaling Festival.
So looking forward to getting some great weather. We didn't talk about weather report today, but we will talk about it at the Journaling Festival. I'm just looking forward to sharing some of the tools, and it's great. It's in person because I'm bringing lots of photos of trees. We're going to be working with imagery. We're going to be working with a card. We're going to be working with my writing maps, my illustrated writing with fabulous trees and rewilding the page writing maps. I'll be talking about how walking and writing can be real kind of motivators for our writing. So lots of food for thought.
What do you want people to come out of the festival with?
I like to know that people have got like a rucksack that they can just dip in and they've got something juicy that they can take out, like a prompt or an image or an exercise that will lead them to a page in a way that feels natural, feels energizing, and feels like an invitation. I
Yeah.
want journaling to be like an invitation. I see it as spending a date with myself. I might not be great on dates with other people, but can we have dates with ourselves?
I love that.
Now I see my journal. It's where I go dating with myself.
It's beautiful. Thank you. This has been epic. And I'm very aware that we could probably keep going on for another 2 hours without having much of an issue. But let's save that for another one. I think we should definitely keep this conversation going. So I'm really, like I said, I'm super excited to see you in November. It's not that long now.
Right.
And yeah, it'd be great. Thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely brilliant. Really,
Okay, Oliver, thank you.
thank you.